Gentlemen, welcome to the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council. This is the CACI Forum, focused today on U.S. strategy towards Central Asia, or U.S. policy towards Central Asia. This topic, of course, is dear to our hearts at the Institute. In 2018, we published a book on this topic called The Long Game on the Silk Road. 2 years later, a official U.S. strategy was released. This was in February of 2020, and therefore it is almost precisely 2 years ago. And in this strategy, we were happy to find many areas of alignment between our own thinking, publications of the Institute, and the strategy, in spite of some remaining quibbles or areas of disagreement. Of course, in the past 2 years, which is not a very long time, but we find that the region and the world have changed so much that the question arises whether the strategy that is on the books continues to be relevant, appropriate, or whether it is in need of an update. We tend to think that there is a need for an update. The main development, of course, being Afghanistan, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way it happened, its implications are an issue for a strategy that was still quite focused on Central Asia's role from the perspective of the US presence in Afghanistan at the time. Similarly with Ukraine, there seems to be little interrelationship between US thinking on Ukraine and US thinking on Central Asia. One of the questions is, should there be any connection? Is there a connection? Should there be one in terms of how the US responds to events in Central Asia with a view to what's going on in Ukraine and vice versa? We think so, but the question is how exactly. In addition, the recent events in Kazakhstan suggest that the region continues to face serious challenges. The reform agenda in Central Asia pioneered by Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan is clearly not an easy one, and there is no regional power that is a natural partner for governments intent to deepening reforms or accelerating reforms. The US and EU sadly appear to be very distant in many ways from the region, and not just geographically, but more so policy-wise than in the past. And if the reform agenda does not advance and is not supported from outside, what are the prospects for the region? And another one is, what is the upside of a successful Central Asian region with institutionalized regional cooperation? Another issue the Institute has been drawing attention to. To discuss all of this and probably more, we have an excellent panel. First to speak will be George Krol, a frequent speaker at this forum, who served as US ambassador to Uzbekistan and then Kazakhstan, among other. Ambassador Krol is an adjunct professor at the US Naval War College and an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. He will be followed by Margarita Assenova, who is a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, author, among other, of the Eurasian Disunion, Russia's Vulnerable Flanks, published in 2016. She is a regular contributor to the Jamestown publication, the Eurasia Daily Monitor, focusing on political and energy security developments in the Balkans and Central Asia. Last but not least, to sum up the discussion, will be Fred Starr, who is the chairman of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, and as such needs no introduction to people who are in virtual attendance at this seminar. Suffice it to say that Professor Starr's writings have been urging a number of steps to be taken by the US government, including advocating for a decade for a new Silk Road strategy, a book on that topic published in 2007. The US strategy with that name was published in 2012. And of course, as well as being an early advocate for what eventually became the C5+1, although Fred might suggest it should have been a C6+1, but we might get to that later. With that, I'd like to hand over the floor to you, Ambassador Krol. And of course, at the end of after our speakers, we hope to have fruitful discussions with the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swante, and thank you to the Central Asian Caucasus Forum for inviting me again. I thought I would start out by trying to very briefly talk about somewhat of the history of what the United States policy towards Central Asia and its strategy or strategies through these years, and then get into sort of the more where we can go from now. And I see three phases that have been a part of how the United States has approached Central Asia. There was the initial post-independence period of establishing relations and the initial goals that the United States would have for Central Asia, but it was wrapped into the entire former Soviet space, which it included Russia and Ukraine and the whole area initially, with many of the same goals put forward by the United States government in an approach to the entire post-Soviet region, and not as specifically about Central Asia. It was also at a time, we're talking about the early 1990s, the end of the Soviet Union, in which the United States saw itself as the only superpower with a great field of maneuver and a great deal of an idea of itself that it could transform and be very influential in this area of the world. And then you get to the next phase of the 9/11, post 9/11, in which this is several years later, many of those goals from that first period remain, but you have this very important security aspect of the United States entering into Afghanistan, and particularly for the Central Asian region, where the American attention to this region was very much through the prism of Afghanistan and supporting American involvement there, mostly military involvement, not so much the involvement of transforming Afghanistan, except later when the whole issue of connectivity and bringing Central Asia and Afghanistan together, the movement of Central Asia out of the European Bureau of the State Department and into the Bureau of South Asian Affairs, in this effort of trying to focus on creating greater diversity and interconnectivity of Central Asia with South Asia, as also a means of bringing Afghanistan out of its sort of marginal role that it had always played in trade and in even interaction with both the South, but particularly with the North, if you're talking about Central Asia. And then we come to this period that we are now. And again, that was the second period was another one where the United States was still viewing itself as the most powerful, influential power, militarily, economically, politically, despite the growing tensions with Russia and China in the Central Asian region. But then we get to what we would call the post-Afghan withdrawal period, which is what we're in now, which sees the United States militarily out of the region. And what does this mean for also the efforts of connectivity, which were crucial to the Afghan policy of which Central Asia was a part? And will this get back on track? Can it be when you have a government in Kabul that the United States doesn't even have diplomatic relations with, but the other countries have to deal with? And then you also have this rise of Russia and China in their role in Central Asia, certainly the start of military maneuvers, say with Uzbekistan, and Chinese involvement, their own even military presence in Tajikistan, the like. And the United States now on a world scene in which it is not the most powerful country, still very powerful, the like, but certainly in the eyes of Central Asians, the United States is less of a force and certainly less of a presence. And this is reflected, or should be reflected, in the approach that the United States should take or has taken to Central Asia. And I think that it is a period perhaps of flux, but again, in bureaucracies, it's very difficult to change the type of attitudes that have become ingrained in the United States bureaucracy, be it the State Department, the Defense Department, and even the NSC. And we see this quite clearly, I think, in the policy to Central Asia, in which the world has changed. We also have in Central Asia, too, this very important development. It's been 30 years since the independence of these countries, and we are now seeing a generational change of leaderships in Central Asia. And we have to deal with them or understand what they are, and not through the simplistic, I would say, prism that we have often looked at them. You see this Uzbekistan, now we have Kazakhstan, which is in its own form of of a change. And just this week, Berdy Mukhomedov of Turkmenistan has just nominated his son to replace him. And then you have the populations have changed. 30 years of independence and the changes have taken place in the societies themselves and what they look for. The younger society, the society that has not grown up under the Soviet Union, as we will see the passing of the generation of Central Asian leaders and those in the bureaucracy that grew up in the Soviet period. And we are seeing this in Kazakhstan, but for the United States and Europe perhaps to react to this, you have to understand and try to understand what is actually going on in these societies and not simply use the same paradigm and focal points that we've had for the last 30 years. But that is very difficult to achieve in the United States because of the way our government is set up and operates and how, in a way, decentralized it is, but how the bureaucratic view and also the sense that Central Asia is not as important and has never been a priority for the United States government, except in occasions like Afghanistan, that can there be a generating of a new set of even goals and strategies as we address this period of change and evolution in Central Asia. You know, to have a strategy, you have to have goals and set those goals, and how are you going to achieve them is what the strategy is all about. And also you have all the tools, but do you have the political will? Do you have the resources to invest and have a proponent for a change that is powerful enough in the United States government that can actually lead to a change in the sense of goals and the strategy to achieve them. I mean, the goals of U.S. policy to Central Asia over the last 30 years has been, one, preventing the region from becoming a source of security threats. Be it that Kazakhstan had a huge nuclear arsenal, or the fissile material and those kind of remnants and legacies of the Soviet armaments, biological, chemical, and nuclear, but also dealing with trying to prevent the region from falling under the sway of perceived adversaries, be it Russia and then later China, and then exploiting the region's economic and natural resources, which we saw with the effort of trying to get into and develop the energy hydrocarbon resources of Kazakhstan, also in Uzbekistan, and as well as in Turkmenistan, with mixed results. But also added to this matter of not wanting the region to fall under the sway of one another, the whole idea of diversified energy corridors, pipelines, and then the interconnectivity from north to south, which basically came out of the fact of the Afghan strategy. And then you have the persuading governments to support U.S. policies regionally and globally, which would be, what was called the global war on terrorism, or the global war on drug trafficking. And also, the strong element of promoting what is viewed as promoting democracy, civil society, market economy, and what has that meant for how the United States has approached that with all of these societies and their governments, and those governments' attitude to these American ways of trying to pursue this goal of promoting these countries' evolution into democracies and market economies that we would tell ourselves will make them stable and we can work with them. And this is an ultimate goal that we seek to achieve. And we don't really question that, because that's like questioning, tenets of the Bible practically. And then encouraging the peoples of the region to view the U.S. positively on their side through public diplomacy and the like. And we've gone through phases of overall American foreign policy. I remember in the Bush W administration, George W. Bush, of Condoleezza Rice talking about transformational diplomacy, of changing, of being catalysts for change in societies. And I know that governments in Central Asia as elsewhere were deeply alarmed as to what this would mean, because they saw this as a threat to their own existence and stability within their own societies. And the United States had all these tools of, diplomatic engagement, security engagement, the way we managed assistance programs through AID or through non-governmental organizations, the public outreach that was been pursued in developing social media, and then the trade and economic support, the efforts to try to promote an integration under the TIFA programs, the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, and then promoting democracy through working largely with non-governmental organizations and not so much through governments who were rather hostile to this kind of approach. But the United States really felt that it could work with governments and with peoples, and in a certain sense, ignore the government's own attitudes to this. And that's what creates certain conflicts and confrontations that we have. Other problems in implementing the strategy that I've seen. Every administration has had a strategy to Central Asia, largely along the lines that I outlined of the goals and the like, but still it was never a priority for the region for the United States. It was a part of other priorities. The United States approach to Russia, the United States approach to China. Pompeo went to Central Asia, went to everywhere, and he preached, that they should be very askance of China, and they should criticize and condemn China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. That was, the Pompeo approach. When Kerry went out there as the C5+1, which is, fine to have these ones. Well, what was the message? It was supposed to be, there will be concrete programs, this will be practical, but then it gets into the matter of resources, and the United States could only pony up, say, $15 million and cobble together, existing programs to make it appear like we have something new here. But really, this goes back to a question. It is not the priority where you get the resources, the thinking, and the sponsorship of it from a political level, of engaging at significantly high levels. There's the annual meetings, and the Secretary of State may visit or not, or have a virtual meeting like the current Secretary of State has had. But then there's the whole matter of the follow-up, the fact that you've never had in the whole 30 years a presidential visit to anywhere in Central Asia, or much in the way of congressional visits, cabinet officials, except when Afghanistan was prominent and you had the Defense Secretary Rumsfeld visiting there, and you had Kerry visiting, and then Pompeo visits because of the China issue, but not a consistent, I would say, high-level attention to understand. And if we take this reaction, for instance, to Kazakhstan and going on, I've been trying to follow what the United States government has been doing or responding, and I look at the websites and look at this, I don't see that there's been ever a meeting or even a phone call with Tokayev, the new president. And it seems that our policy also and attitude in the United States, and particularly in the Washington bubble, has been those that are really interested in the region have been the human rights organizations and NGOs who follow this very much and have a lot of influence on Capitol Hill and the like, with the image that, look, what's happening in Kazakhstan there, I'm hearing word that, massacres had taken place, people have to be held to account, this, which is an understandable reaction. But is this going to color an attitude to dealing with this new government, if you will, that's trying to build a new Kazakhstan, which, again, it's a difficult proposition to do it and what this will mean, but will the attitude simply be seen through the prism that we've seen in the past in Washington, that it's not going to seize the attention, because so much of the attention is on Ukraine, for instance, or Russia or China, and that Central Asia will become more of a reactive stance that is influenced by actors that have had a long history of their interest in Central Asia, like human rights organizations. And, the US military is sort of out of the picture because there's no reason for them to be particularly involved because they're out of Afghanistan. And what's the appetite for engaging and putting resources into developing relationships when they are subsidiaries to these other grander issues ahead of the United States. So I would just say that if you look today, I think our United States relationships with all, if you talk the 5 countries of Central Asia, are kind of, I wouldn't say, I think they're so-so to negative or poor. We have ambassadors in only, if I understand, 3 out of the 5, and in the 2, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, we are probably going to see a change this summer. But what does that mean when you don't have chiefs of mission named for at least 3 of them during a period of evolution and change? We don't have an ambassador in Kazakhstan for this period. I don't know what kind of contacts one can have, at that level, with our missions that are also being restricted because of COVID, and the attitude too that something happens in a country like what was happening in Kazakhstan, Almaty, the instinctive reaction is to withdraw people. And what does that mean for the engagement with the leadership? And that's one where I don't know enough to say how much engagement has the United States had with, if you will, Tokayev and the new leadership in Kazakhstan, which I would think would be an important first step to understand at least the government's perspective and also the people's perspective, on the ground. So I always have felt a new paradigm is needed in Central Asia and how we view it as a region. And can we work with governments and societies as they are and not as we expect or want them to be so much? Can we be more subtle, less patronizing, and encouraging and not insisting? And can we partner with governments more as well as with society itself, playing it very carefully and being less missionary and preaching in our approach, which has been a constant American sort of approach around the world, but I think in Central Asia and the like. But the question is, can the United States government, in the way it is set up and the bureaucratic, if you will, mindset, can it rise, or can there be a different way of looking at this place in a different way, and even looking at it more broadly as a region in a different way? And that would take a new set of goals, a new approach, and not simply a new strategy. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Krol, for that wonderful and very useful overview. Margarita, I'm expecting you to dive into some specifics, particularly on very contemporaneous issues. Margarita, please.
Thank you, Svante. Thank you for this invitation. This is a very interesting moment and very important moment to discuss the future strategy of the United States for Central Asia. So, what has changed in geopolitical terms since the current strategy was developed? And I should mention here the strategy is valid from 2019 to 2025. First, as Ambassador Krol mentioned, this is the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan that changes a big segment of the current strategy, and it has to be updated to reflect not only our withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also the situation in which Afghanistan is at the moment, facing a collapse under the Taliban regime and facing a serious humanitarian crisis as well. On the second place, we have a much more intensified rivalry with China. And third place is, and probably one of the very important ones too, we have increased Russian aggression in Ukraine, along with Moscow adopting a power posture in Eurasia, as well as vis-a-vis Europe and the United States. So this is a development that started in 2014, and there have been before that the conflict in Georgia in 2008, but it's deepening, it's intensifying, it's expanding, and it's becoming a strategy of Russia that is encompassing as well Central Asia. And when we're talking about Central Asia being squeezed between Russia and China, or as local officials say, between the Russian bear and the Chinese dragon, we have to say they are often saying, well, we are used to the Russian bear. We know how to deal with the Russian bear. We're more nervous about the Chinese dragon. Well, that changed. It changed with Crimea annexation by Russia, and it's changing now with the fact that Russia has piled over 130,000 troops along Ukrainian borders, threatening Ukraine with the conflict. We don't know whether there is going to be an open war or just believes that's going to happen. The pressure on Ukraine and other countries that are choosing democratic path are choosing path away from the Russian empire building is going to remain. So this development made Russia very uneasy about Russian pursuits in Eurasia. The latest threat of the Russian whole-scale invasion of Ukraine made it clearer than ever that Moscow's goals are not limited to curtailing NATO's enlargement only, neither changing the European security infrastructure. It is about control of all territories that were once part of the Soviet Union, or as Russian President Vladimir Putin put it, of historic Russia. And these historic Russia territories, unfortunately, include as well Central Asia. And this is where the worry and the nervousness is coming to the homes of every Central Asian, because we had Russian dispatch. Moscow agreed to send CSTO troops to Kazakhstan to quell domestic unrest in January. It was unprecedented, but it was also a power posture in yet another region. And the Central Asian people noticed that. The Central Asian capitals were nervous about it. So leaving aside the move, that this move can serve as a blueprint for suppressing internal revolt in any CSTO member state in the future, its main purpose was undoubtedly inserting Russian power as a way of subversion of Kazakhstan's sovereignty. And as I said, this was the most important message to the Central Asian people. If we remember the reaction of the Central Asian states to the annexation of Crimea, we should remember that it reverberated throughout the 5 states and raised fears of potential similar aggression on their territories. But the situation now is the same. The national governments received a very frightening reminder of their own vulnerabilities, especially when Russian President Putin justified the Crimean Anschluss with the need to protect the rights and interests of the Russian and Russian-speaking populations in the peninsula. Furthermore, Putin rejected accusations of violation of international law by stating that Russia's armed forces never entered Crimea. They were there already in line with an international agreement. So that was a message to Central Asian states that are hosting Russian military bases with thousands of soldiers, making the parallel with Crimea even more unsettling. These statements were a very chilling message to the Central Asian states. They are vulnerable on both counts. Although Russian populations have receded, have emigrated, many of them have a natural reduction of birth rate, increase of death rates, and from about 40+% in the past in Kazakhstan, they have only 18% of Russian population now. Still, these populations are a factor and an excuse and could serve as justification of intervention in Central Asian states in this way. But I have to say here that Russian influence in Central Asia is, regardless of the fact that they sent CSTO troops and they intervened when the Kazakh government called them to come and help, Russian influence in Central Asia has been receding, has been reduced over the years, especially since the annexation of Crimea, and that's very important. It's mostly economic, it's related to trade. In 2015, after the intervention in Crimea, the economies of Central Asia contracted, their currencies plummeted, the sanctions had a very, very severe effect on those economies. Remittances coming from Russia drastically declined, and they forced many labor migrants back to return home. So all these factors are also a reason to fear now if Russia attacks Ukraine and severe sanctions follow by Western countries, the United States included, how this is going to affect the economies, particularly those that are members of the Eurasian Economic Union. But the Eurasian Economic Union has stopped growing since that time. Since 2015, we don't have growth. We don't have new members. There are no new members of CSTOs. There are only 6 members of CSTO, and as many as 5 in the Eurasian Economic Union. And countries that plan to join, such as Tajikistan, withdrew their application, went back on their desire to join. Now we have only Serbia joining as an observer, so it's not really a member. So Russian actions have consequences in the region, in Central Asia as well, although they don't directly concern Central Asian states at this point, although the danger is only right now in Ukraine. Before it was in Georgia. But if we judge by the solidarity that we see in social media with the Ukrainian people, especially in Georgia, it's just a flood of support for Ukraine on Georgian social media, but also in Central Asia. And judging by some of the demands of the protesters in Kazakhstan, that Kazakhstan withdraws from CSTO and from all Russian structures, there were such expressive such demands before. We have to say the public opinion is changing, and although Russia wants to restore its empire and wants to fight, to confront China, to compete with China in Central Asia, that is going to be a weak position for Russia. It's a vast region that has a lot of needs. It will have to change a lot of policies in the future, including energy policies, including development of alternative energy sources. It is facing water problems. It is facing transformation that is beyond just building rule of law. Rule of law society is very important, but they have to build equitable economies. They have to build economies for everyone. They have to address the problems that Kazakhstan faced in January with the protests, and those problems have been present for the last at least 10 years, if not more. And some of the countries are addressing them more successfully than others, but this is not an area where Russia can help. And at the same time, probably this is an area where the United States can help. Because we see the battle, Central Asia becoming a kind of a battleground, kind of a buffer of competition between several forces, between several players, Russia, China, India, Iran, Pakistan. But we don't see the presence of the United States in Europe as forcefully. Any strategy that is going to involve China and Russia has to address Russian aggressive behavior and Chinese behavior as well. Cannot avoid Central Asia. It has to encompass Central Asia. It has to make it part of it. It cannot be a separate one. It should be a comprehensive one that corresponds with American interests, both vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China. That is Central Asia in between, in the middle, feeling threatened right now by Russian new imperialism, and feeling threatened by potential for the expansion of China, although it's not as forceful at the moment as it used to be a few years ago. And I'll stop here and leave it for questions.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Dr. Sar, you're on.
Well, first, I would like to salute Ambassador Krol's presentation. I agree with it 100%, and I have to note that for all our criticism of U.S. strategy and even U.S. actions in Central Asia and Afghanistan, We have had quite a number of very competent ambassadors there, and we should be proud of them, and I certainly am. Now, turning to business at hand. Thesis 1, Central Asia is and must be a priority. Why? Look at the map. There it is, with the longest border, Kazakhstan, longest border in the world. It's so long that if you were to paste it on the Atlantic Ocean, you'd get from Moscow to New York. And then there's the huge border with China, shared by 4 of the countries. So this is very serious real estate that we're talking about. Look on the map. There is not just China and Russia, but also Iran and Pakistan, absolutely adjacent. So to talk about a pivot to Asia and ignore or use that as an excuse for ignoring Central Asia is absurd. And of course, it's self-defeating, and it's a big gift to those who don't wish us well. So first of all, roll back all this deprioritizing of Central Asia after Afghanistan. That's nonsense. If actually it gives us a chance now to think it anew, and it's time we do so. Now, in doing that, what are we seeking? Well, we're not proposing to supplant the presence of China, the presence of Russia, or at some future point, the presence of Iran, of Pakistan, and India in Central Asia. These are relationships that go back thousands of years, in the southern ones at least. No, we're not proposing to supplant them. We're proposing that there be that we be part of a balance among them that the Central Asians can use productively to confirm their sovereignty and self-government. In other words, we should be clear up front. It's not the takeover of Central Asia that we're seeking. It is rather seeking a balance for their external relations that would be supportive of their sovereignty and self-government. Now, that is a point which has been in all our strategies, policies from the beginning, namely affirmation of sovereignty and not affirmation of self-government, and it should be there. The only problem I have is what are we willing to do to bring that about? Now, if you go back over the 30 years of our relationships there, the one thing that stands out, and which Ambassador Krol didn't dwell upon, although he's well aware of it, is that we have tended to identify the growth of democracy as and civil society, what we call civil society, as a precondition for our broader relations. Do that, then the reward comes from the United States in terms of broader relations. No one in the region views it this way, and quite soberly, they respond, look here, to talk about democracy and self-government and civil society, when you have great powers breathing down your neck, and when our very sovereignty is threatened, it's absurd. And therefore, what I'm suggesting is not to abandon these as strategic objectives, but to admit that the phasing is exactly opposite of what we've been assuming to now, namely that we will help build security, build self-government by development. In other words, we're not going to insist on democracy and civil society tomorrow morning. We don't want regression, and we should be firm on that. We want some evidence of commitment and progress, but that we recognize that until they are secure, these qualities are not going to be advanced. Now, beyond that, let me turn to the very central question of Afghanistan. Afghanistan didn't cease to exist when we left. Many would like that to be the case. It isn't. Look at the map. But much more important is the reality that for the rest of Central Asia, and as I'll indicate, I do consider and continue to consider Afghanistan as part of Central Asia. For the rest of Central Asia, the very sovereignty and self-government that they are seeking can only be achieved by opening trade routes, the ancient trade routes and traffic routes to the south. And this means not just roads and railroads, but it means hydroelectric power, transmission of everything. Until these routes are reopened, they are going to be under the thumb of Russia and under the thumb of China. It's as simple as that. Now, therefore, we have to, again, rethink our strategy with regard to post-US Afghanistan. And I think that's a doable proposition. First of all, I think we should define it as part of Central Asia and include it under a Central Asian strategy. Second, it seems to me that it would be wise to treat it as well, you set the table, and this is one chair that is not going to be filled until certain preconditions are met. We should specify what those conditions are very clearly, and they should be sober and realistic and attainable, but they should exist, and we haven't done that. But in the meanwhile, and this is the key to everything, in the meanwhile, we should be willing, the United States should be willing to cooperate fully with the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, other international financial institutions that are working in Afghanistan with the objective of opening the trade and transport routes that I've talked about, including pipelines. In other words, we can work through and with existing international agencies, all of which are functioning there today. And that will give us an excellent observation point to see how the country is evolving as a whole. And that could lead potentially, I don't want to be overly optimistic on this, let's be stone sober, it could lead to recognition. And then a full seat at the table, which Afghanistan now lacks and doesn't deserve. Now, so far, so good. Then there's a question, the great taboo question, security. The United States government is organized in such a way that you have a strategy towards Central Asia, which pertains basically to the to the State Department, to the Department of Commerce, occasionally other departments, but not necessarily to the Department of Defense, which has its own relationship and its own set of ties, which are old and deep. And by the way, which included NATO over many, many years through its Partnership for Peace program. Now, what I'm suggesting is that you can have the best strategy in the world, but unless you coordinate and integrate within your own government, it will fail. And that I can give you 50 examples of how this lack of communication and coordination within the United States government has negatively affected our actions in Central Asia and Afghanistan over the last 30 years. So what does that mean? It means meeting together. It means having regular organizational links. And by the way, it's very interesting. We have talked about the C5+1. Let's remember that was proposed not by anyone in Washington, anyone in the Obama administration. No, it was proposed by the Kazakhs. The Central Asians want it. Now, in terms of coordination and integration, the C5+1, unfortunately, has been relatively passive. It's been treated as yet another set of bureaucratic meetings. It hasn't had the high level attention that it warrants. And what I'm suggesting is that be activated, that it be able to command some money to back our policies, and equally important, that be coordinated and integrated with the many other countries that have C5+1s that preceded the United States. We were the last to get on board on this. Started with Japan, European Union has it, South Korea has it, but we should be talking with them, coordinating with them. We're not. There's some casual relationships here and there, but there is no common strategy among these open countries with regard to Central Asia, and there should be and there can be. Final point that about security. Yes, DoD operates quite separately from the Department of State, as it did in Afghanistan to our great loss, and as it still does all over Central Asia. Many say, well, that's because really there isn't a post-US departure from Afghanistan, there's no military role in the region. Nonsense. Every country in the region is still, in spite of progress, and notable progress, in spite of that, they're still dealing with problems of drugs, drug trafficking. They're still dealing with problems of terrorism. They're still dealing, in other words, with core security issues. And the United States should acknowledge this openly and integrate that type of security concern into its overall strategy. And we should strengthen, because anything that strengthens their ability to protect their borders is strengthening their overall security. We can do this. We should do this. We should have been doing this instead of these rather minor and insignificant steps that we've been taking up to now. It's time to ratchet that up. We have good models of how to do this. Our Pentagon people and at CENTCOM in Tampa know very well what could be done, what should be done, and the Central Asians themselves would welcome it, and neither China nor Russia has the slightest basis for objecting to that. So that should be part of and integrated with our overall strategy. But to emphasize at the end, this is an important region. Afghanistan is part of it, even though for the time being, it's not going to be understandably part of US action there. Nonetheless, we have to be thinking long-term. Strategy is long-term. It's not what you do tomorrow morning. And beyond that, it's time for the US to have an integrated approach to the region that acknowledges that we seek open societies, that we seek participation, democracy, but at the same time that we realize these qualities will not flourish until basic security is established. And that's within our powers to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of material covered or a lot of ground covered in the three presentations. I would like to start by going to a bureaucratic question. That relates to how the US government views Central Asia. And I can't help but notice that obviously you've touched on this has changed over time. But I was most puzzled to see what happened in the transition from the Trump to the Biden administration, where we actually see that different parts of the US government are putting Central Asia in different baskets. We saw that the Trump administration at least had the same, as had the Bush and Obama administrations, by the way, the same setup, if I remember correctly, which is that Central Asia was in both the National Security Council and in the State Department connected with South Asia. With the Biden administration, the National Security Council changed that, and the person responsible for Central Asia is now the person responsible for Russia. The State Department does not organize itself that way. That's an issue I'd like you to comment on, perhaps starting with Ambassador Krol. But the question really is, what are the current bureaucratic boundaries adequate? Is there a solution to them? Is the South and Central Asia model still relevant? What do you think about this issue? And is it even the most important issue? It seems to me it may be one, but not perhaps the only issue we have to deal with.
Well, I would agree with you, Svante, that it is an important issue, and this goes also to Fred and what you're saying is, you know, should be done and the like, and that's all. I would agree with it, but the matter is, can it be done? Because of the bureaucratic makeup and dynamics of the United States government. One of the issues is, where does Central Asia lie? And as I noted, that up until the second term of George W. Bush's, it was part of the Europe and Eurasia Bureau. And so a focus was largely on Europe and the European focus, which still is, it seems, the major focus of the United States government even to this day. And you see the leadership in this Biden administration are really people that have spent most of their time dealing with Europe and not really with China, and certainly not in South Asia or Central Asia. But to the point of organization, in the Obama, when George W. Bush, it was moved to Central Asia when Condoleezza Rice was in the State Department into the South Asia Bureau, and it was like bringing together, you know, mating two animals that were, of different breeds. South Asians were, the South Asian people of the State Department looked at the Central people and who are you? You're like Martians. You're, aliens. We have no conception of it, and so within the bureau itself, there was a matter of, well, how do you put this together? And there were ambassadors at the time when this was done in the field in Central Asia who thought this was a big mistake, and also that the Central Asian governments themselves thought it was a mistake to take them out of the Europe and Eurasia Bureau. Now, then, when the Obama administration came, it remained. It hasn't changed to this day. That is, Central Asia is part of the South Asia Bureau. But at the NSC, the National Security Council, Central Asia, which had been put into the directorate with South Asia at the end in the Bush administration, was taken out and given basically to Mike McFaul, who was the director of Russian affairs, and it became Russian and Central Asian affairs, which was why the question, that, and as I understood it, was that because, Mr. McFaul had experience in democracy promotion at NDI and others, knew people in Central Asia, and wanted this in his portfolio rather than just only Russia, which like. And then when you had the Trump administration, it went back. They took Central Asia, and it was part of South Asia directorate. And then the focus there was on Afghanistan, largely, for the Trump administration. And then the Biden administration comes along, and it's like they bring in a lot of, their decision was, for whatever reason, to take Central Asia out of South Asia and put it with Russia again. Why? I don't know the reasoning why, unless it's simply that, well, this is what we did in the Obama administration, and and that. Again, while they still have the same individual who's the director for Central Asia affairs, who was at the NSC in the Trump administration, was carried on at being the Central Asia person in this directorate with Russia. So there is a continuity of the individual who is involved most at the NSC with Central Asia. So and then you have the Defense Department, which took Central Asia from what was the European Eurasia Bureau, even before it was done at the state, and put it in the Asia Bureau, where again, a lot of the focus was on Afghanistan and China, and that Central Asia therefore doesn't get that attention. So to your question, to the major question, as somebody who worked in the bowels of the interagency, how difficult it is to bring together the different viewpoints of the major players and including in the Congress, because there too, there is a very powerful element, say, in the Senate foreign relations, not just the foreign relations, but even more importantly, the Appropriations Committee, which is very much focused on appropriating money for the priorities they have, which have generally been the democracy promotion. And as Fred said, the conditionality that we shouldn't be wasting money on dictatorships. They have to prove themselves first. And so you have all of these people somewhat at the table, and then the NSC tries to pull them all together, and they come up with a paper, and then the matter is, okay, the paper is made, it's approved, and then who implements it and who sees the implementing? There is no mechanism, frankly, for seeing this through, because there isn't the high level interest on the part of either a president or a vice president or the Secretary of State or some powerful bureaucratic sort of proponent for this that can really push the bureaucracy to get these things done. And so it all kind of fritters away. And one of the problems I had since in Central Asia is how to prevent Central Asia, our policy to Central Asia, from becoming a victim of our policies to Russia and China and others. I remember when the Georgian issue with Russia came about, it was like, well, should we be, there are all these sanctions on Russia, which could affect the Central Asian economies. And nobody who's developed these sanctions in the European Bureau, which was all focused on punishing Russia, considered the Central Asian, dynamic and how they would be collateral damage for this, or the positions that we're be encouraging them to take at the United Nations of condemning Russia and the like. The Central Asians couldn't do that because they have to live with these huge neighbors of Russia and China and play it. And to Margarita's question, I would say from somebody who was dealing with the Central Asians at the time when Ukraine, the Crimea one, the governments themselves were, yes, they were taken aback by what happened in Crimea. Their feeling was the Ukrainians should not have let this happen because of how they, in a way, didn't know how to manage the Russians. And they were fearful that they felt they know how to manage them because they don't want that fate to befall them, certainly in Kazakhstan, that befall the Ukrainians because, and so there wasn't this massive support of Ukraine. There was sort of a rather, why they don't know what they're doing with this thing. And so there was not a great deal of support. Now, I don't know if you're saying now with younger people and the like that they find common cause with Ukraine, but I think what we've seen is that can be an existential question for many of these Central Asian countries that have no choice when they have huge neighbors and dependencies on Russia and China. And for the US to go in and sort of encourage them to take strong stances against Russia and China, these governments feel that makes them more insecure to do so than to follow, as it were, the US lead. And they will be very careful not to try to cross us, but on the other hand, not to. And we saw this, I would say, in Kazakhstan, of President Tokayev. The invitation of the CSTO in Russia was perhaps a way of managing so the Russians could be a part of the solution rather than looking on and being fearful of what is going on there. And that Tokayev's going to Moscow, which could be criticized by some as saying, oh, well, now Kazakhstan is fully in the Russian camp. I see this as diplomacy of a very, I would hope, skillful kind in an area of the world you can't depend on anyone but your own wits to do so. And I think the attitude of saying, oh, they're now in the Russian camp, or they invited the Russians in, and are they ever going to leave? I would think that instead of looking at it as an aggressive stance on the part of Russia, it was something of a Kazakhstani stance of how to deal with that problem and as it were, neutralize it while they could deal with their own domestic issues. So we have to look at these things through, I think, their different frameworks. And I know it's a little more than the question you asked, Swante, but I think we have very difficult structural issues in our own government that inhibit the making and implementing of a coherent strategy. We also have the 4-year program of every 4 years of an administration. You have new people that show up and they all want to do new or different things. And the bureaucracy kind of says, well, wait, let's continue doing what we're doing because it's very disruptive. Anyways, I'll stop there. And
I'd like to add a major point here, namely that this entire discussion has taken place with barely mention of a single individual human being. The problem is organizational. George Krol and I completely agree on the structural issues that have been described. Those are very real. They are soluble. The problem is, it's parallel with that, we've not had people who are knowledgeable. We have people with not the slightest idea what they're dealing with in this region. And as was true in the case of Afghanistan, as a result, the most superficial cliches have passed for news. I'm not going to pause on the failure of our news media, but let it be noted that the coverage of Kazakhstan by the New York Times, they began by trying to cover Kazakhstan from thousands of miles away, I think in Estonia. Then they moved on to try to do it through their Moscow bureau. Good luck there. And then they tried to deal with it through Pakistan, I believe, and they went all around Robin Hood's barn without ever getting someone in Kazakhstan. How absurd. If our news media don't know what this region is, what it's about, how can we expect the public to? But more serious is the attitude on part of many of our senior administrators that we're only dealing with one goal at a time. And as a result, there's no peripheral vision. And this one goal at a time enables them to dismiss everything else. The idea that Central Asia isn't important, well, it isn't as important as Beijing right now. Let us admit that. But if you look at it a little more contextually, you realize it's absolutely central. It gains power because of its crucial location and its relative openness to modernity and to the values that we have. Now, in the face of this, we have many senior officials who either know nothing about the area, and I mean nothing, or dismiss it. I won't pause to pound away at Madeleine Albright's famous statement when she was Secretary of State. What do you do with Afghanistan, she would ask. She said, build a fence around it and forget about it. That's more or less what we're trying to do now to the whole region. It won't work. We've got to pull up our pants. We've got to focus. We've got to have a strategy that is integrated across the various branches of the US government. It has to place their needs in perspective too, not just ours, and understand that our needs cannot be met unless we're addressing their needs too. We do that and we'll see a new day and everyone will benefit from it.
Thank you. Margarita, would you like to add something on this,
Yes.
these bureaucratic issues, please?
Well, in terms of bureaucratic issues, the region is on a crossroads. It's going to be between Russia and China, between other countries in the region. It's inevitable that we cannot split it between one department or another. These departments, wherever Central Asia is located, they will have to work matching what they're doing in different countries around with what the Central Asians want. And it, of course, as Fred Starr says, it has to be matched by their own needs, and their biggest aspiration here is to protect their sovereignty. And we have seen, and I absolutely agree with Ambassador Krol, how each of the Central Asian states has developed policies to keep Russia at bay, work with China, put some limitations there just to protect their sovereignty. We saw in Kazakhstan under Nazarbayev one of the biggest achievements of Nazarbayev was to manage to keep Kazakhstan independent and keep Russia at bay. And that is supposed to continue under Tokayev and under further administrations, because it is the essential goal of the Kazakh people to be independent. Uzbekistan has been in and out of CSTO a couple of times. They have been teasing with the Eurasian Economic Union. They have been trying to please Russia at some level, keep Russia at bay at another level. Tajikistan has been refusing the border guards of Russia to control their borders. Turkmenistan has adopted a policy of strategic non-alignment in the regional organization. So each of these countries has managed somehow to deal with the main challenges, geopolitical challenges in their own region. But at the same time, those challenges now with Russian aggressive behavior in Ukraine are increasing. And it's not just about Russia being aggressive in one region of Eurasia, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Georgia. Moldova is also being subject to a pretty aggressive behavior on the energy front lately. It's also about what is going to happen with Russia in the future, and whether Russia is going to manage to keep its coherence as a state, and what could happen if that starts breaking up. So our strategy has to be really forward-looking and much further assessing the place and the aspirations of one of the people in the region, two of the neighbors and regional actors, and three of our interests, and what could happen in the future as a result of this aggressive policy of Russia, as a result of China's expansion to Eurasia. These are not changes that can happen in a vacuum. They do have effect on the countries and regions that are their object. So I don't see this long-term planning of how do we support and protect security and sovereignty of the Central Asian states in terms of different scenarios that could play in the future.
Thank you. We have only a couple of minutes left, but there's a question from the audience, which is related to Uzbekistan, whether the US should focus on supporting Uzbekistan as a regional leader, or whether that would alienate other countries of the region. I'm not sure if anybody would like to pick up on that.
I'd be glad to.
Please.
Of course, we should work very closely with the Uzbek government. It is undertaking one of the most dramatic reform processes anywhere in the Muslim world that has global significance, not just regional. It's opened the doors to its neighbors. They were closed for many, many years, and they're now open. And it's striking that what you might assume to be competitors, namely the two leading countries in the region, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, far from being competitors, and they have announced that they are actually allies, a very telling term. No, relationships throughout the region have greatly improved, and let it be said that all the Central Asian governments are united in looking to find those practical areas with the government in Afghanistan, the Taliban, that contest the seriousness, dedication, and competence of that government. And they see that through the opening of transport corridors, which Ambassador Krol has spoken about. This is very important development. It is crucial to the viability of the other Central Asian states. And that is why all the major international financial institutions are today, post-American departure, working with the Taliban government to get those transport corridors open, and especially the railroad that would take them to the sea. This is all going forward. It doesn't mean that anyone's happy with the Taliban. On the contrary, it gives a window for observing their progress or lack of it.
Would anyone else like to move in there?
Ambassador Krol.
Ambassador, please.
I would just state that, you know, as a former ambassador to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Deputy Assistant Secretary for the region, I think it is somewhat of a mistake for the United States to play a favorite and say this one country we're going to focus all attention in. I mean, when Islam Karimov was president, when I was ambassador there, and I'd have conversations with him, it was often the U.S. asking him, well, why can't Uzbekistan be the leader of the region because of its geographic position and the like? And he answered quite bluntly. He said, "They'll never accept my leadership." And he would go through the list of it. And if you were talking to the Turkmen or the Kyrgyz or the Tajiks, they too, and I think even to this day, while it's a much better relationship with the new president of Uzbekistan, there is still this fear that the Uzbeks will want to be the dominant one. I remember Niyazov, the first president of Turkmenistan, would always point out to us in the 90s, he said, you know, yes, there's the Russia factor, but we have a neighbor who thinks they're the successor of Tamerlan. You know, wink, wink, nod, nod. And you'd have the Kyrgyz and, you know, saying, and also with Kazakhstan, there was also an effort like, well, we should focus all on Kazakhstan. But then you have the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks and everything saying, wait, you know, we don't want the Kazakhs to be telling us what to do. And like, and now you basically have a Kazakh-Uzbek, if you will, condominium of the two talking as being the big powers. But that makes the Tajiks and the Kyrgyz and the Turkmen nervous because they fear, as you put yourself in their position, you know, that they would be dominated by neighbors that have been rather domineering to them. And so the issue of trying to create a Central Asia, you know, as they would say among themselves, yes, we should be together. There are the internal dynamics and differences.
I think there are in our country as well.
Yeah, exactly. But I think they're far more, they're very, very clear there.
The reality is, you touched on an absolutely key point, and that is that by playing favorites, which we've done from the beginning, it started with Akayev in Kyrgyzstan. It was the Switzerland of Central Asia. We'll make that the core of our U.S. strategy in the region. Utter nonsense, utter nonsense. Then we've moved around to other places. What that is, to be blunt about it, our playing favorites, handing out bonbons and posies to the guys we like, this is nothing short of the old Julius Caesar divide and conquer method. Now, who plays that? Well, the Russians do. The Chinese do. Why are we doing it? This whole program, this whole session today, very important material, is about a Central Asian strategy, not a strategy for each country. Within that Central Asian strategy will be the specific tactics for each country. That we haven't discussed today, and it should be discussed. But absent the overall structure, the individual steps not only will be meaningless, but they'll have the exact same divide and conquer aura about them that the Russian and Chinese started tactics that we object to have.
But bottom line is we have 5 states that are newly independent states, but they're old nations. Some of them very old nations, very old people. So how do you designate the leader? There is no way to do that. I absolutely agree with Professor Starr. This is it has to be distributed somehow between the 5 states so that all of them are engaged, and let them take the lead in certain matters that they're stronger in taking the lead on. It's very difficult to explain to the Tajiks why the Uzbeks are going to be the leader and why the Kazakhs are going to be the leader to Kyrgyzstan. I don't think it's possible. There are only 5 states, and our attention should be divided between them, and their reforms supported according to the way and the pace of those reforms as well.
Why not let them decide who's their leader, or how they distribute leadership?
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. There was another question. I don't think we have quite the time to answer it because it's about the role of Central Asian states in resolving the Ukrainian crisis. It seems to me that at this point, the question has risen over the heads or capabilities of the Central Asian states. But I will take the prerogative as chair to mention that the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute only about a year ago released a report about the international mediation efforts that Kazakhstan had undertaken, in which there is a considerable section about the efforts by Kazakhstan to mediate in the Ukrainian crisis in the early days from 2013 to 15 or 16. And I would urge anybody interested in that matter to consult that study. With that, we're exactly on time to finish. I would like to thank you all three for a very fruitful discussion that has helped us, I think, to identify some of the key priorities, but also some of the key problems, whether they be political or structural, in U.S. foreign policy. I'm afraid that some of those were already known a long time ago. We have nuances of that. I think it's important to keep this discussion going, but the question will really be how to move forward in terms of where the U.S. government stands. What I come away with perhaps most strongly is that the importance of Central Asia lies in its location, but the location is also its curse in terms of how it gets attention from American policymakers that are focused on one of the great powers around it at a time, seldom two or more. And when we have what I think is a serious lack of broader strategic thinking and long-term strategic thinking in Washington, rather than jumping from one crisis to the next. So far in the past 30 years, it's been that the greatest attention to Central Asia has been when there is a crisis in that region. Let's hope we can find a way out of that, because I think there is a substantial contribution that the US has made and can continue to make to support Central Asians in their efforts to have pluralism, geopolitical pluralism in their region. I'd like to thank all the audience for participating and for questions that came from you. And again, thank you to our speakers. And we will reconvene soon and continue to discuss topics related to the region. Thank you.